Okay, welcome to our next session of the Equine Pasture Management Series. This session is going to cover waste management. Well, we're to that time of year where everybody starts thinking about what are they going to do with all the waste that's starting to be accumulated across their pastures, out of their barn stalls. And so there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of things sometimes that there's better ways to handle manure that we have or things that we don't necessarily think about when we are handling manure. So this topic in the next 30 minutes is kind of go over that and discuss a few of the options that we might have when trying to handle something that's going to occur on an everyday basis if we have horses. So as we progress through here, and this kind of first area is just a general description of what you typically will see on most horse farms. And the reason why I highlighted in red, that's what we a lot of times will look at and see. And we'll see a lot of our pasture that has two very different heights of grass. You've got one that looks like it's pretty lush and green. And then where the horse is actually grazing this kind of blue squiggly lines, you can see it's pretty much grazed down to the surface, kind of like a putting green. Where there's just not much grass or blades there to grab. And we talked about the importance of having go back, importance of having that leaf space and that leaf area for growth. So a lot of times this is what we look at. And this right here, when you see big clumps of grass right here, this is a good indicator that you have lots of manure surrounding these areas where the grass is really green and growing. So as we come here, this is just kind of another picture of a field out in wide open. So you've got all these horses that are grazing, and I've gone through here and just circled each little pile of manure that's surrounding these areas. And as you can see, the more I circled, there's kind of an area, it might be up to a foot or so in circumference all the way around, where each one of these piles are at, that these horses aren't going to graze. Well, as they start to put more manure piles, these areas start to cross over and get a larger and larger surface area that the horses are not going to graze around these manure piles. And we'll talk about the reasons why they're not going to. But you can quickly lose a large amount of pasture space as these piles start to pile up and the surface area starts to really spread out. So just to give you a little bit of an idea what the yearly big picture scope is for horse manure, you know, this is a simple problem that we typically look at it and just go ahead and say you probably have an average of 1,000-pound horse, that they're going to produce almost 50 pounds of manure per day. If they're out on pasture, you may not notice that, but if they're in a stall, you certainly notice that as something you have to haul in and out of there on a daily basis. When you start to put the math together, you're getting 18,000 pounds roughly of manure every year just from one horse. And most people don't just have one horse. So you're looking at about 9 tons of manure. And then especially if you're stall boarding or you keep your horses in stalls a lot, you're adding the additional amount of shavings or what other material you may be used. That's going to add up to maybe another 20 or 30 pounds. So you're talking about a massive amount of material that you're dealing with on a daily basis. Now, it's not all bad. From horse manure, of course, we talk about it being waste, and we'll talk a little bit later about, you know, the components of horse manure. But for every 2,000 pounds or a ton of horse manure, we're getting 11 pounds of nitrogen and 2 pounds of phosphorus, which these are, for our pastures, these are very important materials. It just depends on the form and how we get it into our pasture and incorporate it into whether we can actually use it in a format that's available and stays within the environment. So look at the impact of manure. And a lot of you guys will have seen these and you know probably most of them, but one of them is just the sheer volume, like this picture is showing, just the sheer volume of manure and what it looks like on the pasture. Then you get into sight and smell. And especially in this area, that can be a pretty big impact when you don't have your horses on the back 40 per se. You know, you have neighbors all around, and some will have horses and others will not. And, you know, with comes manure, not only the sight and smell, but you also get the flies that come with that. So not everybody likes to have horses around them. So the better job we can do of keeping our pastures clean, that will make for a better neighbor. The costly removal, it's just a sheer number that it's going to be pretty high when you talk about the volume of manure produced by just one horse to get this manure actually removed from your property. There are services out there that we'll talk about that will remove it for you, but that is a very costly enterprise to try to do when you talk about the actual amount of manure. Parasites, and that's the reason why we see those big areas that horses won't eat around. We're talking about parasites. There's a lot of parasites that come in manure because it is waste, and we'll delve a little bit deeper into that here in a second. The environmental, talking about the impacts of what is incorporated with manure and what is released into the environment. And then just about sheer pasture space. You look at all this manure on here, if you take a 5-acre field that has 2 horses on it and you start taking away 25, 50% of your pasture because the horses won't touch it because it's got all this manure in here, you're really reducing your amount of space that's available, especially if you're trying to pull some type of forage out of here. So manure can have a lot of impacts on a lot of different areas, but we're going to talk about ways that we can try to manage that. One of these is just to delve a little bit deeper into parasite management. As we talked about, the horses don't want to eat around their manure. That's because they are wise enough, or it's just kind of an innate genetic ability to realize that within their manure are parasites, and lots of parasites that are being disposed of. Some of them are leaving their body, or some are entering the manure from there. And if they were to eat around that manure, then they may contract those parasites again and continue the infestation, and may lead to some severe health problems. But parasites typically are growing in this cooler weather. So it takes a very, very, very extended period of very cold temperatures for you to wipe out the parasites, but they do like the cooler weather. So right now, that's just been kind of ideal for these parasites to be thriving and going. And just kind of on a side note, this is conjunction with taking care of the healthy animals, but the fecal egg count is an important thing to know. We talk about deworming horses on a pretty frequent basis, and more and more of our dewormers, we're starting to see some parasite resistance. Well, the less you can expose parasites to the same dewormers time and time again, the less they're going to start to build up that resistance. So if we can do a fecal egg count on each one of our horses to know the type of parasite load that they're carrying, if they've got a really low parasite load, then we may not need to use our dewormers quite as frequently as a young horse or an older horse, or a horse that has a high parasite load. So that will help reduce the exposure to these parasites, to some of these dewormers, and hopefully reduce the resistance of that. Reducing that fecal egg count is reducing maybe their access to having to eat grass around their manure. So that's something to be thinking about as we go. We get into water quality and the environment. So when we talk about manure and urine, they contain nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, waste. So, what is manure? Manure is what the animal was not able to utilize when they ate whatever feed material they had. They weren't able to use whatever those materials were, and so they were then passed out through the manure. So kind of on a nutritional side note, if you're feeding a diet that is extremely high in protein, maybe lower in carbohydrates like your hays, you've got a very high diet of concentrates, that horse may not need quite the amount of protein that you're feeding him. So that they use protein is actually made of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And so they utilize the carbon and the oxygen because they don't necessarily have enough hay. So they utilize that. Well, they don't need the amount of protein or the nitrogen, which makes up protein, that you're giving them. So they go ahead and pass out that nitrogen into the manure. So for one, it's very expensive, but they're passing out excessive amounts of nitrogen into the ground, same as phosphorus and potassium waste. So, and so what happens is if we pile them up in different areas, especially on the sides of hills or near creeks, we start to get the leaching of those materials that will leach right on into our our rivers or our creeks or our streams. And things like high phosphorus are what cause a lot of algae growth and decrease in oxygen in the water. So we start to see a lot more plants growing, and more specific, a lot of the algae. So we kind of get into that runoff and some kind of undesirable things that come from the environment through manure. So let's get to the point of trying to figure out how we can actually deal with some of these things. When we look at it, just leaving a pile of manure out there, if you kind of think about an insulated mug or your Yeti cup or whatever that is, you're thinking about the outside as kind of insulating the inside of what's in your cup. And so the same thing goes with a big manure pile. If you were to leave a manure pile piled up on the ground, what the outside of that manure pile is doing is insulating the inside of that manure pile, which is where all of our parasites are at. So if you left just all those manure piles out on your pasture, it's going to take a long time for the sun to break down in the weather, to break down and kill all the parasites on the inside, because they have that nice warm protective layer on the outside that's protecting them from all the elements of the weather. So what a lot of us do, so a lot of us know that, and so what do? We think, okay, well, I've got to go ahead and knock down those piles of manure and spread them out. And in theory, this is correct, but it's much more specific and much more to the point of what time you have to do this and how you do it. Because really, what you're doing in the short term, when you knock down or you drag those manure piles and spread them out, you've now taken a point of parasites in one pile, and you've now spread them out over an entire surface area. So if you had a pile that was only 6 inches wide, then you hit it with a drag, now that pile may be 5 feet wide. And so you've spread it out. So ideally, the weather is going to work on these parasites a little bit quicker this way, but it may not work as quick as some of us think. So when we talk about trying to reduce the number of piles and drag and spread out our manure piles out in our pasture, we talk about you need to have an ambient temp, a daytime temp of at least right around 85. Now, sometimes it can get a little bit lower on you've got full intense sun, but you need 85 days, and you need to pull your horses off for at least 1 week. At this point, you're going to get the fastest UV penetration of those parasites, and the UV sunlight is what's killing the parasites. So we need to have 85 days roughly, or 85 degrees with about 1 week to get to the fastest kill that we're going to get. The cooler it is, the longer you're going to have to pull those horses off of that pasture in order to make sure that we have a full kill on all the parasites after you've already drugged. And it continues to go much longer. You start to get into these very cool days when everybody likes to do it in the fall, the fall, in the winter, and sometimes in the spring. You're going to take much longer. You might be taking a month, if not longer, once you have exposed all those parasites, to go ahead and get hit by the UV light and kill them. So you got to be very conscious of the time to do it. So we highly recommend that you only do this during the summer, when we can get the fastest penetration of the UV light to kill them. And what this big issue is on continuous grazing. So if you've only got one pasture and you go ahead and drag it, you've got nowhere to pull them off. So what you've done is you've just taken and greatly reduced the size of your pasture, because you've just spread all those parasites all over the entire pasture. And so the tool, as we call it, a drag or a harrow, that we pull behind a tractor to try to knock down those piles. Another option, and I always put this one in because it is an option for some, but I think it's kind of funny, but they do have vacuums, so you can go around your pasture depending on the size of your pasture. If you've got a little paddock, this might work out pretty well. The little turnout paddock, maybe it's a couple acres, you can buy one of these vacuums and go around and suck it up and get it off. So what you're doing is just taking that parasite right off the pasture, and once again, that horse should be able to graze that area pretty quickly. But more specifically, so we had those two options. One of them was dragging in the field, and the other is if you're specifically if you're using a barn or a stall to house your horses. So you've obviously got to remove the manure and the materials from those stalls in that barn, and you've got to do something with it. So there's 3 or 4 different options here. We'll kind of go through each one of them. One is just to dump or haul to a site. And typically that involves somebody, leaving a roll-off container where they will pick it up every week or so, fill it up. Sometimes this is for some of our bigger barns. And so you dump it into their container, and then they'll come and pick it up and take it off and probably compost it back at their house. But this can be a very expensive thing to do. Another one is just spreading the fresh. So we see this quite frequently on a field. You go in there, you dump it right out of the barn, right into your manure spreader, and you take it out to another area and you just spread it out. Well, just like we kind of mentioned right here, you've not done any composting, and all you've done is just spread the entire parasites all over your entire field. And so it makes it very difficult to put anything back out there. So if you're just putting if you're just using this field as a area to spread on, just be conscious that you're not getting rid of any parasite prevention, and any weed seeds that are in there, you're now spreading them all over your new field. So if your new field didn't have anything in it and you went and spread manure all over it, any weed seeds that came through the horse are now going to be spread on your nice new field, and they're going to be covered. So even though you thought you were just putting a lot of nitrogen on the field, you're actually adding a lot of parasites, but almost more importantly, you're adding a bunch of new weeds to that field. So if you just spread it fresh like that, that's the downside of doing that. You can pile it and leave it. A lot of people will just put it in a pile and leave it, and they may come back in and spread it, a couple months later. Well, for one, you've got a point source of pollution. So without proper composting, that's just going to sit there. All that material is starting to break down. And that's where we start to get that leaching or the runoff of some of those nitrogen, phosphorus waste products that come from manure. So if you've got a point source of water near there, that's going to start to leach towards that environment. And that's going to be pretty undesirable for our environmental side. And it's just kind of a nasty thing. You're going to have lots of flies and things around there. So one of the most desirable options, sometimes one of the most confusing and least understood, is trying to properly compost it. And I think a lot of people think that if they just pile it up, that that's called composting. And it really is not composting at all. And so to properly compost things, it goes through a lot of processes. And your manure pile is going to go through a lot of processes as well. But here's just kind of a few highlights, and we'll get into specifics of it. But your compost pile has to reach 130 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's pretty hot. And the only way you're accurately going to be able to tell that is with a compost thermometer, and they're roughly $20–$30, I think, and they're pretty long. They might be 2–3 feet long. But the only way you're accurately going to be able to compost is with one of these thermometers. Big benefits of it: you're going to kill the weed seeds. So if you properly compost it, and this is not a quick process, but if you properly compost it, when you go out to spread that manure, you've killed a lot of the weed seeds. So if you spread it on your nice field, you're not spreading seeds again from all the weeds that may have been in your hay. You're also going to be killing the eggs and larvae in your parasite, which is one of our most important things. So you kill those, and so the biggest benefit is now we actually get to utilize the nitrogen that comes from manure. So we get to utilize all the positive things that come from composting our manure, and we get rid of all the negative things like the weeds and the parasites. So trying to figure out how to compost, we have, this is a common one. We kind of see these little stall bays like this, but you want it 3 to 5 feet deep, and that's just so that you can manage it in a timely manner with either yourself or a small tractor that might be able to help you. But 5 to feet across in piles or windrows. And so that's one where you're probably more likely going to have a little tractor that you can come through there and turn it every so often. But the key to these things, there's 2 big keys. In any type of composting, you've got to have air and you've got to have moisture or water. We don't want an anaerobic environment. An anaerobic environment involves no air getting in there, because those are the type of bacteria that we do not want. Those are the type of bugs that we don't want. So they will not properly break down the manure like aerobic bacteria or bugs are. So we provide aeration. This is where every so often, we'll get into it, every so often you have to turn the entire pile, either with a shovel or pitchfork or your tractor. And then another good thing is you can see right here, we have a PVC pipe, and this is letting air on and off. So we're allowing air to come in there, but we're also allowing this to breathe, so we can pull air out of there so it doesn't get too hot sometimes when we do it like this. So it's key to have one of these in there. Sometimes you don't have to aerate as much or turn it over as much as if you have one of these PVC pipes in there to allow it to kind of self-regulate itself a little bit better. But the key is getting air in there, and the other key is adding water. You want to have that compost pile to be about a 50% mixture. So there's time when you need to add water, and there's times that you need to kind of reduce and let it dry out a little bit. And I've got kind of a little cheat sheet in one of the next two slides that we can talk about, but you can refer back to it as you're starting to compost. If you're starting to have these issues, this is the solution to each one of these. So this is the key right here, we got back to it, is it's got to reach this 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't get this, you're not going to get complete composting, and you're not going to get the desired where you have, when you're applying your manure back to your field, where you're getting only the nitrogen and some of the valuable things. You're going to get a lot more of the negative things like the parasites and the weed seed. So the key is you got to do this. Now, this is not a short-term project. You might be talking about, depending on the size, it might be a 3-month to 6-month process, depending on how much you're adding and going. So you don't want to keep adding materials to an existing compost pile. You kind of want to get one started, a larger one, and then start actively turning it over. So you don't want to add compost materials to one that you've just been doing for 6 months. So that's going to slow it down a little bit. But this is a big key, and this is one of the things that I see on a lot of things, just kind of reflecting back to taking out things besides manure out of your stalls. A lot of times we see high amounts of shavings when you start cleaning out your stalls, especially if you start cleaning out your stalls on a more of a daily basis, and you start to remove a lot of shavings on a daily basis. When we start to remove that, the actual materials, we actually get a high percentage of that pile is going to be wood shavings, and actually a lower percentage is going to be manure. And when we start talking about that, it takes a lot longer time for you to compost wood chips versus manure, or the same thing would be for shavings. So if you look at how long it takes for a tree branch to lay on the ground and break down versus manure, you'll notice that tree branch is there for a lot longer. Well, this is almost the same thing. And so a lot of times we'll see people go ahead and they'll take those things, that pile of stuff, and put them right there in the manure spreader and spread that out on their field. And they'll come back a month later and they'll come back to our office and say, I've been spreading all my manure all over our field, and the field's just doing terrible, or it's starting to die off. Well, what you've done is you've spread a little bit of manure on there, but you've spread a whole bunch of shavings that are suffocating out the grass and causing a lot of issues. So just go ahead, if you're removing a lot of shavings and wood chips from your stall, you need to either have them hauled off, or you need to go through an intense composting period. But it's going to take much longer to actually compost these things. So sometimes when we start talking about that, have a high level of wood chips or shavings, is that you start to add a few other things. You might even add something like urea or some old hay to give you something to break down a little bit quicker, to give the bugs something to eat, because it just takes them so much longer to eat the wood chips or the shavings. So a lot of times we like to, and you have to worry about the actual moisture level a lot too. So if you have a really high level of wood chips or shavings, you're going to have to compost a lot more intently, and might look at adding a few things. So if you have any questions about this, that's always something you can talk to your extension office about. But this is the little table that I talked about, that if you want to reference back to it as you're doing a compost pile. These are a few things. If you start to see the problem, here's probably your cause, and then here's your solution as you go through these. And we won't go through each one of them, but it's a great table to reference back to if you start to have a problem and you start to see one of these signs that your compost pile is changing for the worse. That you can come back here, reference this, and then use it to help solve your problem and get your compost environment back to the correct place. And then these are just a few alternatives. Now, these not necessarily work for everybody, but here's a few alternatives outside of, picking up all your manure, dragging it, or composting. Is you can just remove your horses. So if you drag it, just remove them and take them to another field for another 3 or 4 months, 2 or 3 months, something, whatever, depending on the time of year, and just let it all break down. Second one is you can convert it to a hay field. You can allow that pasture that has all that manure to be converted. You can kind of seed it, make sure it's a quality hay field, and use that and turn maybe your old hay field into a pasture. You can rotate horses with another group for the season. So you can pull them off that pasture and then rotate them with, if you've got goats or something like that, rotate them with that. And the reason why we talk about that is many of our parasites that we have for our different types of animals, where it's cattle, goats, sheep, horses, they're very specific to the host. So a lot of the parasites that we see in horses, we may not necessarily see in cattle. So if you rotated your animals, if you rotated your horses to your cow pasture and your cows to your horse pasture, they may be more willing to eat some of those around some of that manure, because those parasites aren't necessarily specific to them. And so they may not affect them to the degree that they would affect horses. So that concludes our environmental waste management talk. If you've got any questions, we'll be happy to talk about them next. So I will stop recording here shortly. The next pasture management series is August 23rd, and we'll talk about reseeding your pastures and getting them ready for fall. We also have on June 28th, our equine extension specialist, Dr. Jenny Ivey, will be giving avoiding heat stress and tips that we can use to avoid heat stress this summer talk on June 28th. So we'll send out more information about that. So at this point, we're going to stop the recording